Hey, welcome to the Benburb Priory podcast. Benburb Priory is a place of peace, vital history, and Christian charity in the heart of Ulster. We offer this podcast as an extension of our mission, so please like, share, and subscribe in order to support our ministry. And in this episode, I'm joined by the wonderful Dr. Crawford Gribben. So just to begin then, Crawford, can you tell us, please, a little bit about your background and some of the key events in your life that have helped to form you and your love for Christ and His church?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks very much for having me on today. It's great to be in the famous Benburb podcast. I live over across near Ballymena. I grew up in Scotland, as my accent probably suggests, but my parents were from here. My parents were Christians, brought up in an evangelical church to understand some of the central claims of Christianity, and been very grateful for that. That's obviously, while that's something that forms you as a child, it's obviously something that as an adult you've got to possess for yourself. We are, my wife and I, we are Christians. We have 4 children so far, very glad to have them. And we belong to an evangelical fellowship in Ballymena. So that's my background. In terms of work, I teach in Belfast at Queen's, teach history. And the book we're talking about today isn't really anything to do with what I teach. But it's very much what I love reading about and thinking about.
Excellent. And then just today, let us look at that wonderful book then, The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland. So first of all then, Crawford, can you tell us a little bit about the background of the book, really what makes it distinct, and what do you hope readers then will ultimately take away from it?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Well, the book is probably the only available book at the minute that describes the whole history of Christianity in Ireland. Obviously, in the last 20 or 30 years, we've lived through a kind of an earthquake in Irish Christianity, and that's affected everybody, I think, in all of the churches. And it's raised huge questions about the credibility of Christianity. And these are questions, I think, that Christians have to address and think about in a serious way. So what this book is trying to do is to describe, as insofar as possible, the ways in which Christianity arrived on the island, the way in which it shaped the people who lived in the island and created good things for them. And I try to emphasize that in the book, that Irish Christians were really brought together under the banner of the church. In some ways, the Christian faith united what was otherwise a very diverse set of people on this island and gave them a common identity and a common purpose. And obviously, along the way, there's some wonderful high points in that story. You can think of great cultural artifacts like the Book of Kells. You can think about the amazing story of St. Columba, whose 1,500th birthday we celebrate on the 7th of December. And we can think through the monastic federations that get set up, the way in which Irish Christians set off to convert the Picts, the Anglo-Saxons, how Irish monks head off into Central Europe to do missionary work there, how others end up in Orkney, Shetland, the Faroe Islands, even as far away as Iceland, so that when the first Vikings reach Iceland, they discover that Irish monks were there before them. And, I don't know if you take Brendan the Navigator as a kind of a factual story or not. It's certainly possible that Irish monks hopped on from Iceland across to the New World and got there ahead of the Vikings as well. There's no reason why that could not have happened. So, there's some amazing stories along the way. There's obviously a lot of sadness and tragedy along the way as well. It's not unfortunately an entirely celebratory story. There's a lot of betrayal. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of persecution of one kind of Christians by another kind, and that's not always a very honourable story or a very happy story, but it's part of the story. And then we come to the 20th century. After 1922, we've obviously got the formation of 2 different jurisdictions in the island, which are both really being driven, maybe in different degrees, but both driven by different sets of religious nationalism. And certainly in what becomes the Republic, I think there's an extraordinary attempt to set up a fully functioning Christian state, which I think people up here, Protestant Catholic people up in the north, maybe don't always grasp the theological ambition of De Valera and the people who were talking with him about what the new Irish state should look like. And then, it's a sad story towards the end of the 20th century, a story of division and violence, principally here in the north, though occasionally in the Republic as well. And then, we arrive at the sudden onset secularization of the 21st century, where people like you and I are kind of wondering what happened, what just happened to us, and where do we go from here? So that's really what the book's about. It's sometimes described as being quite gloomy, and that might in fact be true, but hopefully there's things in there that readers might be interested in thinking about as well.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Crawford. And I should say that at least Tim Severn has proven with his career recently since Brendan Cuddill went. So actually, one thing you mentioned at the beginning of your book that I think is most interesting is the difficulties of learning about early Christian Ireland, actually. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why that is?
Yes, thanks, Mark. The big challenge of doing anything from the 5th, 6th century is the challenge of getting written sources. So, when Palladius comes as the first bishop to the Irish Christians in the year 431, he's coming to look after what we imagine must be a very small Christian community at that point. So, in other words, the Christians are on Ireland before any missionaries come or any bishops come to look after them. They're there. We don't know where they come from. We just don't know. So we can kind of infer what circumstances were like for them through looking at archaeological evidence, but it takes a while after the arrival of the first Christians for written evidence to begin to accumulate. Ireland before 431 was a pre-literate society. There was no written language. Nobody was writing anything down. Writing comes to Ireland with Christianity. Books come to Ireland with Christianity. Our libraries are testaments to the impact of Christianity on Ireland. We take libraries for granted, but libraries are a consequence of Christianity, as is education, as is medical care, and of course, as is the most important thing of all that Christianity brings, which is the message of how sinful people can be made right with God through Jesus Christ. So all of this is going on 5th, 6th centuries, but it's really hard to try to figure out how that happens, when that happens, how quick the Christian message spreads, how quick Christian institutions begin to get built. It's much clearer maybe by the 7th, 8th century, but you're right, Mark, I think the first couple of centuries are a bit tricky, even to know the names of people who are on the ground, where they're working, or what the impact of their work might be.
And something that I think is great about your book is how you show the profound influence of the Christian faith on every layer and level of Irish society from those early days to now. Similar to Tom Holland's Dominion in a broader, more Western sense. It's like a little microcosm of that, which I think is fantastic. That's a compliment from my perspective. And I want to ask you then about that early period, though. So from what we do know, what are some of the distinctives that you found most fascinating and interesting amongst the early Irish Christians?
That's a really interesting question, Mark, because the Irish Church is distinctive and it stays distinctive for hundreds of years after its foundation. So when that early Christian community gets established, it doesn't develop in a way that is true of most European church, or the European church at that time, the mainstream Catholic European church at that time. And there's several reasons, I think, for that. Number one, Ireland is not an urbanized culture. There's no urban centers, which means that European style episcopal oversight can't operate in the same way. So, on the continent, on mainland Europe, when the church gets established, bishops are put in individual cities to look after territorial administrations. But in Ireland, there are no cities. So the church has to improvise, and they do. They begin to build these monasteries, which are sometimes located on sites of earlier significance, maybe sites that had some significance for the pre-Christian religion. But these monasteries begin to build up networks. These networks take on flavors of their own. So we mentioned St. Columba a couple of minutes ago. There's a Columban Federation that extends from Iona in the Western Isles of Scotland all the way through Ireland and into England and beyond. There's obviously the Patrick network, which is based in Armagh, and there's also a network based in Kildare, which is associated with St. Bridget. So there's lots of these monastic federations, in a way, we can kind of think of them as like competing denominations in modern terms. They've all got their own way of doing things, but they're part of one church. But where power is located in that church is a little bit different. Where authority comes from is a little bit different, because it's not always obviously located in the episcopal hierarchy, in a hierarchy of bishops. It's generally located in synods, and these synods are attended by bishops, yes, but also by the heads of monastic federations and monasteries, and sometimes by clerically educated kings, of whom there are over 100, 150 for the first couple of centuries of this period we're talking about. So the issue of authority really makes the Irish Church distinct. It develops its system of authority in a very unusual way, but also it's distinct liturgically. Now, at different times, those monastic federations line up with the mainstream dating of Easter, but some of them take much longer than others. And the Columban Federation, for example, is one of the latest to be persuaded that they've got to sign up to the liturgical calendar that the European Church is promoting. And so, actually, for over 100 years, people in Ireland couldn't agree when Easter should be celebrated. Should it be this calendar or that calendar? And obviously, as time goes on in a liturgically formed church, that kind of ambiguity cannot continue. So eventually, there's a kind of a coalescing of liturgical opinion in Ireland, and eventually it gets pulled into sync with the European Church. But there's also differences, I think, in terms of practice. So the Irish Church has married priests, and has married priests more or less up to the Reformation. And that just becomes a kind of a key feature of the Irish Church. And lots of people complain about it. St. Malachi in the 12th century Reformation there, the Gregorian Reformation, they try to deal with the issue of clerical celibacy. They don't really succeed. Even at the 16th century Reformations, you get both Protestant and Catholic commentators in the Irish Church complaining or observing, often complaining, that the Irish Church is always out of step with the European norms, especially in this issue of clerical celibacy. Now, funnily enough, maybe we'll talk about this later on, you could argue that the Irish Church becomes Catholic at the Protestant Reformation. That's one of the kind of paradoxes of this story. But that, I think, is when it finally loses most of what makes it unusual and gets pulled into European norms in a much more meaningful way.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Crawford. And if I might take it back to modern times and frame the issue in a way that maybe is of interest to people like ourselves, then why is it important then to bring the Christian story back into the centre of understanding Irish history, and going beyond maybe more recent secularist social constructs that you hint at in the book? We see these in identity politics and how that filters our view of history, for example. And what are some of the distinctives and important points that you'd like to restore and bring back to the centre?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I suppose the current trend towards identity politics has left a lot of people wondering what they are. So the question is no longer who you are; it's what you are. And of course, media. The media gives us lots of options based on this or that aspect of our personality or circumstances. But one of the things that the media doesn't really encourage us to believe is that fundamentally we are Christians, and that the truest thing we can say about ourselves in terms of our identity is that we belong to Jesus Christ. So in a way, that's really what I want readers to take away from this book, that for a long time, to be Irish was to be Christian. Now, I think, and to be a Christian in this island was to be Irish. I think that's also a very problematic construct that has to be unpicked, because Jesus tells us in his parables, there's wheat and tares growing together. He warns us that not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will inherit the kingdom of heaven. So, but setting that to one side, I think the real challenge for me of the present is just that Irish Christians need to discover their identity in Jesus Christ. That is the most fundamental thing that can ever be true of them. And in fact, 100 years from now, it'll be the only thing that matters to us. Whether we're in Jesus Christ or not will be the only thing that matters, the only identity that's actually going to last.
Amen. And then I think as a way in, and in an increasingly secular society. From a cultural Catholic background for myself and not being a practicing Christian for many years, I was still drawn to and attracted to the old sites, the old archaeological points, and it still appealed to me. And you see it in Seamus Heaney's work, this underlying Catholic sacramental understanding of the cosmos, but a lot of people don't know that it's there. Again, like Tom Holland's Dominion book. So that's something that I think, with the likes of your work, is a point of entry, perhaps. So if we might go back then to some of the archaeological finds, whether that be from early history right through, what were some of the ones that you recounted and think are most important and full of life then?
Yeah, that's interesting, Mark. I mean, this probably is a really bad response to your question, but the archaeological sites I actually got most excited by were some of the pre-Christian archaeological sites. They kind of helped me think about, what religion meant to people who'd never heard of Jesus Christ. So, you're going to worship something. So what are you going to worship? And, as far as we can tell, through looking at, constructions like at Newgrange, which is the world's oldest astronomical clock, from what we can tell, they're doing the most obvious thing we possibly can do, which is to worship the sun. I mean, if you weren't a Christian, why wouldn't you worship the sun? It makes perfect sense. It keeps the world alive. So, sort of thinking through that, and then thinking about the ways in which early Christian writing began to take account of that and think about that was really interesting. Looking at some of the early Christian poems that, as you say, it's almost kind of like a Gerard Manley Hopkins sense that the world is charged with the glory of God. And you get that, whether it's sort of marginal comments in some of the scribal work that's been produced in the monasteries, where the monks are talking about, well, most famously, the most famous cat in Irish history, Pangar, but also, birdsong and things. There's a real sense that these men, because they were men, obviously, in monasteries, were really thinking about the world as God's gift to them. That, it's a kind of a theatre of his attributes, his character, and that his character can really be seen in the way that, birds sing and the sun rises. And, even in Patrick's confession, there's a real sense there, I think, that he's able to see the glory of the created order as something that tells us something fundamentally true about God, that he causes, as Jesus says, he causes the rain the rain to fall on the righteous and the good, that in some ways the whole of creation is a display of God's kindness. And, I think that really shines through in a lot of that material. But in terms of other sites, thinking about Skellig Michael and the hermits sitting out there, 7 miles off the coast of Kerry, obviously not doing Jedi stuff, but doing sort of Christian stuff. It's a place I would love to go and see. But yeah, there's lots of examples. Slieve Donard, where St. Donard sits at the top. Some of these constructions are massive. Some of the pre-Christian constructions are extraordinary. I think it's really significant that the early Christian constructions were so humble. It's literally, a hermit house on a deserted island. It's literally a pile of stones at the top of a mountain where a saint used to sit. And that's kind of it. And in a way, there's something very true about that in terms of how Christians imagine themselves as strangers and pilgrims on the earth who are looking for a better place, as Hebrews puts it, a better place in the future. And, I think there's something very theological about architecture. And architecture, the way that we design our buildings, the buildings we use for worship, architecture is very expressive of where we think God is, of how we think we approach him, whether we keep him very distant from us, or whether he is someone who invites us, or whether he's a God who invites us to draw near to him. So, it's fascinating that you mention buildings and so on, because I think they're part of the story in a fundamental way, because while we don't always have written texts, sometimes we find the buildings that Christians construct resonating with theological ideas, that in a way it's a theology in stone, but it's a real theology, a theology of, a crafted theology that shapes how people worship in really profound ways, I think.
Excellent, thank you, Crawford. And I should say too that I have a friend, an evangelical friend from the States, from a Greek background, Louis Marcos, and he describes how the Greek myths and different things are fulfilled in Christ. And I think I get the same impression from your book as it pertains to Irish mythology and the stories of Cuchulainn and how they found their fulfillment in the Christian story. Then I'd love to ask you a little bit about that. And then what was the place of and value of myths for Christians through the ages, and how did they get taken up into this great cosmic Christian story then?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark, because, I mean, I suppose Christians, when we read fiction, we're looking for true stories, and a true story from a Christian perspective is a story ultimately of redemption. You know, we can figure out truth in stories by thinking about how well it corresponds to the Christian story. But, you know, I think you're right. A lot of early Christians, a lot of monks took delight in recording those kind of Iron Age sagas, Cuchulainn and, you know, the Tawn and the different things like that. I mean, they took them very seriously, and they seem to have loved them. Now, over in England, Christian monks were doing a similar kind of thing, but they were often trying to Christianize these stories very deliberately. So if you read Beowulf, for example, similar kind of text, but it's really heavily Christianized. Whereas in Ireland, the monks seem to just record all of those sagas for their own sake. They seem to have loved a really good kind of action movie, you know, action movie night at the Priory. Maybe that's something you guys should develop. But they just seem to love it for its own sake. Now, as time went on, I think there was a much greater effort to try and reinterpret that pre-Christian tradition to make it, as you say, correspond to true stories. The big true story, the story about Jesus Christ. And, you know, someone like Patrick Pearse in some of his letters writes, I think, very movingly about Cuchulainn as a Christ figure, as someone who dies on behalf of people. And Pearse writes about that, I think, in a very moving way. I mean, it raises the big question, of course, about how do Christians think about their pre-Christian ancestors? And, you know, for us, you know, 1500 years later, that there's a bit of distance there. But for people in the first couple of centuries of Irish Christianity, that was a very immediate concern. You know, where's my grandfather? Where's my great grandfather? How does this message affect him? And these stories then, or the effort to reinterpret these stories as somehow being anticipations of Christ, is a way of doing that. I mean, there's two ways I think that you can think about this kind of mythology. You can either think about it as actually anticipating something that's yet to be revealed, or you can think about it, as some 17th century theologians do, as a kind of a cultural memory of what once was the common knowledge of humanity. So the knowledge of God that's given to Adam and Eve in Eden is remembered after their expulsion from Eden. But it's not remembered accurately as the generations go on. It becomes more and more approximated. And so the kind of codified mythologies of the world are in some ways blurry, out of focus dramatizations of themes that once human beings understood. But yeah, I mean, it's a big issue. But I mean, I think what really strikes me as interesting is that when the monks recorded those stories, they recorded them and seemed to enjoy them just for their own sake, you know, as if actually that was okay. You know, we don't need to dress everything up in Christian garb. We can actually just say, here are these stories. I really don't understand some of the stuff that's going on, but they're great. They're really good fun. No, I honestly think that's what's going on a lot of the time.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Crawford. And then if I might look to St. Patrick as maybe hitting some of these points, then what are some of the most interesting and informative elements then from the real St. Patrick, if we might call him that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to know who the real St. Patrick is. You know, he's a much contested figure, isn't he? Patrick's really interesting because he is, as far as we know, he is the first missionary to go beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire on his own initiative. So that's really distinctive. Secondly, he's also a slave who escapes from slavery. So he's writing about slavery from the experience of having been enslaved. And of course, we know from his letter to some of the sailors who are coming to kidnap Christians that he's appalled by slavery and finds slavery extraordinarily wicked, which is a position that not many people take in that particular period. There's big debates, as you know, about where Patrick came from. In the book, I suggest he probably came from just outside Glasgow, for you know, and I could probably even tell you which team he supported. But you know, he seems to have been a Welsh speaker, so one of those kind of washed up Roman colonies that are left behind after the Roman troops withdraw around 407, 408 AD. And he seems to be in one of those kind of isolated communities of Roman Christians way up in the north of Britain, probably around Dunfermline Rock. And he seems to get taken across to Mayo, where he's held as a slave. He escapes, we don't know where. His writing is remarkable in lots of ways, but one of the ways in which it's remarkable is it's totally imprecise about dates, about places, about experiences. But you know, he's very candid, and he tells us that he himself had grown up as a third generation Christian, but he didn't believe the Christianity that his grandparents and parents believed in. His grandfather was a priest, his father was a deacon, but Patrick, until the age of 16, had no Christian interest at all. And it wasn't until he was kidnapped and sent to Mayo, probably, that Christianity really came to mean something for him. And he writes about praying to God and finding that God answering him in remarkable ways, giving him the vision, obviously, through which he pursues his escape.
Fantastic.
So Patrick's a fascinating person, but he's really got to be disentangled from lots of mythology that's grown up around him. We don't know if he explained the Trinity Orthodox, trying to figure out what he's doing and what he's saying.
Yeah, thank you for that, Crawford. And something that comes across in your book is how in the earlier days of the church in Ireland, things were more decentralized, and that changed over the aeons then. So I wanted to ask you, what were some of the contours of this kind of centralization of the church, both for better and for worse then?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we see that probably most obvious in the Gregorian Reformation in the 11th, 12th century. And, you know, we might think very highly of St. Malachy and hold him up as a great paragon of Irish Christianity, which he clearly was. But Malachy was part of a Reformation agenda that was the excuse for the Norman invasion that took place in the 1160s, 1170s. So that, you know, what we might think of as the first English intervention in Ireland was something supposedly warranted by the Pope, supposedly because the Irish church was so out of step with the European church that supposedly it needed the Normans to come to use military force basically to sort it all out. Now, of course, as we know, there's lots of other things that are mixed up with that. It's not simply a religious reformation. There's all kinds of economic, legal, political, military features of that invasion as well. But it really begins to pull the Irish church into much more effectively into the orbit of the European church. So centralization takes off then. By that stage, the Vikings have come and gone. Well, they haven't quite gone. They're still living in places like Oxmantown, in what's now Dublin. And they are being sort of molded into some kind of cohesive whole. So by that stage, the Irish church is composed of Gaels, of the remnants of the Vikings, but it's also now dominated by Norman power. And you know, there's big disputes about who can be promoted up the hierarchy of the church. The statutes of Kilkenny introduce a kind of, we might say in modern day terms, a kind of an apartheid into the Irish church, where Gaels are allowed to progress in certain areas but not in others, but real power is always going to be maintained by the Normans. In fact, over time that seems to break down because the boundaries of Norman power keep on shrinking. So after the Norman invasion, they very quickly take over huge amounts of land. But as the decades go by, that power begins to retract and shrink. And that happens so that the political boundaries change, even as the ecclesiastical boundaries remain more or less the same. So the church is this kind of stable overlay of power and authority in the island, whereas the political boundaries are continually shifting. And I think what that means is that the church is essentially able to re-Gaelicize, if that's a word, large parts of what were once Norman territory. And even in Dublin, which is meant to be a kind of a Norman stronghold, you find evidence of Gaelic priests ministering and working apparently to good effect. So, it's a good example, I think, of the way in which the church is able to sidestep what was meant to be an apartheid system and to work around it. I don't suppose its goal was a political goal. I suppose its goal was a spiritual goal or a religious goal. But I think it definitely served to nullify some, certainly not all, but some of the very unpleasant racially driven or ethnically or culturally driven agendas that were at play in the island. But when we talk about the divisions between Normans and Gaels, they were real and they were really dangerous. So that there's examples of various Norman churchmen appealing for there to be a crusade in Ireland. We tend to think of the crusades as happening in the Middle East, but some of these guys were appealing for a crusade to happen here against some aspects of Gaelic Christianity. So, religious division is not a modern thing on the island. It's been here for a long time, but the centralizing pull of the Norman invasion, I think, was a way to try to deal with that.
Thank you for that, Crawford. And again, even when we use those terms like religious, I think it comes across in your book that things are so integrated that you can't neatly talk about a religious or a secular realm, or it's politics. It's all sorts happening at once.
Yeah.
And if I might go in a slightly different direction now, then I wanted to ask you about, so we're blessed, thank God, with a copy, one of 500 in the world, of the Book of Kells. So it's obviously famously housed down in Trinity, but we have a copy, fortunately. So I want to ask you a little bit about that. And what was the motivation for and the importance of such great works of art like the Book of Kells then?
Yeah, it's interesting. We think of the Book of Kells as a work of art, and that's how it's displayed in Trinity, isn't it? We're meant to go and sort of be dazzled by the colour and the intricate designs. And if you read the panels, in the exhibition area, it's all about the sort of techniques of book binding and how it was preserved and so on. I mean, the really important thing about the Book of Kells is the message it contains, which is the story of Jesus Christ, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Not only is it amazing to see the Book of Kells, it's also amazing to pick up any modern English translation and read those stories. They're really important stories to read. But the Book of Kells is obviously an iconic Irish artifact. If anyone thinks of a book, it's an iconic book. Never mind anything else. In some ways, it's ironic that it's thought of as being Irish, though, because the Book of Kells is actually a product of a Christian civilization, a European Christian civilization. So there's features in it that hark to the kind of style of Irish design at the time, but there's also aspects of it that reach around the Mediterranean, German, Middle Eastern, Hungarian references, visual references. So the book, one of the things the Book of Kells does is to tell us that the early Irish Christians in those first 400 years of Christian history, they weren't inhabiting some kind of backwater. They were part of, for all that they were maybe different in some ways from the European church, they were part of its currency, they were part of its culture. And when they were thinking about being a Christian in Ireland, it wasn't some kind of culturally limited thing. It was open to the great reality of Christianity, which is that it is universal. And the Book of Kells is designed not as an Irish book, but as a universal book. And in some ways, the design of the book is making the point that the contents of the book reinforce that it's a universal story dressed up with a kind of a universal aesthetic, because the claims of Christ are universal and the appeal of Christ is universal. I would just add that the irony that it seems as if the Book of Kells was actually designed on the Columban monastery on Iona in Scotland. So if I can say something for Scotland, much. It would simply be that might at some point need to be returned.
Oh my gosh. Well, we'll be getting our copy from Benbow Priory. So if we might move on to another element that I think is fascinating in your book, basically in what ways then did the Christian faith, as you sort of hinted at previously, create this notion of the Irish as a unified people then, and help us to understand ourselves as a nation?
That's an interesting and complicated question. When the first Christians arrive, when they begin to establish their institutions, there's approximately 150 separate kingdoms on the island. So it's not cohesive. It's very divided, and there's all kinds of differences between those kingdoms as well as similarities. But over those 150 kingdoms, there's like regional kingdoms, and there's a kind of a hierarchy of kingdoms that moves that gets kind of centralizes power. One of the things that the Christian Church does is to align the structures of authority with the structures of those over kingdoms. So it kind of pulls people together to recognize that within their diocese, there might be, 60 different kingdoms, but what they all have in common is their allegiance to Jesus Christ, expressed in the worship that's conducted through the community of the church. And that seems to be how that's working. Now, later on, obviously, that the single cohesive identity of Christians is shaken. I just mentioned the Norman invasion. Before that, we could talk about the Viking invasions. These disrupt what's otherwise looking like a kind of a nation building activity. But we don't really talk about the rise of nationalism as such until much, much later. So there's definitely a sense of Ireland as a Christian, even as a Catholic nation in the 17th century. There's a kind of a national aspect to that self-identity. It probably only becomes a nationalism by the time we come maybe to the end of the 18th into the 19th century, when obviously the constitutional situation is very complicated and disrupted, and Irish Catholics are beginning to identify themselves as a nation as opposed to the state. So while Protestants in Ireland tend to line up to support the state, Catholics in Ireland tend to line up to support this idea of nation. So nationalism becomes then a very important aspect of that. So I think that seems to happen. It's complex, it's ambiguous. I think it's quite hard to plot exactly how that move from diversity towards unity, even if it's a kind of a competition between unities, how that works. By the time we come to the 20th century, two jurisdictions, two rival religious nationalisms, it's much easier, I think, to talk about that and to see how those are very distinct ideas of nation that are in play both in the Dublin administration and the Stormont administration as well after 1921, 1922 or thereabouts.
Mm. And alongside that internal direction, if we might call it that, you also point throughout the ages to this external and missionary zeal that we see. And you mentioned the monks and how, as one, contrary to how one title has suggested from, I think, Cahill, they didn't actually save civilization, but they did play a vital role. And I'd love to ask you a little bit about that. Can you tell us about the distinction you're making there and why that's important?
Well, I mean, Thomas Cahill's book is really good fun. If you read it, I mean, it makes a big claim that Irish monks basically preserved what was left of Roman civilization and then began to export it again. I'm not sure that would necessarily stand up to really hard historical scrutiny. So I don't think Irish monks saved civilization. It didn't just depend on people in this island, the whole concept of civilization. There were lots of other civilized parts of the world as well, so you can sort of deconstruct it rhetorically a little bit. But one of the things that the Irish monasteries did do is preserve major texts that were maybe being lost elsewhere or forgotten about elsewhere. When the Roman Empire begins to contract in the 5th century, there is a real crisis of learning, and that seems to continue into the 6th, 7th century and maybe even a wee bit later. And it's in that period that the Irish monasteries begin to collect books, copy books, circulate books, building libraries, kind of like the library you have in the Priory there at Benburb, but sometimes on a much smaller, sometimes on a much larger scale. The libraries that they instituted were not only places for collecting books, but also for making books. So the monastery in Iona, for example, is, we think, the home of the Book of Kells. But some of those other illustrated gospel books, the Book of Durrow, other books like that, some of the Psalm books that have been found recently, these are books that have been copied, loved, pored over. But those monasteries also include material that we might not associate with religious practice. So they're also collecting, books from classical authors, Greek and Latin authors, pre-Christian authors or non-Christian authors. As we talked about before, they're also collecting what comes to be known as Irish mythology. So, they're also interested in developing the literary tradition of Ireland. And in some ways, it's kind of ironic, I suppose, that the access that we have to the world before Christianity comes as a consequence of the activity of Christian monks who try to preserve it. We really depend upon the work of these men to know very much about what Ireland was like in that period or previously.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Crawford. And then you mentioned, and this is maybe a big question, it's a hard one to cover, but you do describe going from the monks and that earlier church to one that became more worldly, if we might call it that. I want to ask you maybe some of the hows and whys of why the church became more worldly and the impact that had in Christian congregations and their practices then.
Again, that's a really big question mark, isn't it? I suppose in a way you could say the Irish church was always worldly in that its organisation reflected the social situation, the cultural situation it inhabited. You could say that the way that the Irish church was organised didn't always reflect biblical norms. You could argue that the way that Irish monks in particular thought about culture maybe wasn't always as critical as maybe they should have been. But I think certainly by the time we come to the Norman invasion, that represents a step change in the way in which the church is being organised, because all of a sudden it is being pulled into a European orbit. So the old monastic orders in Ireland, the Columban Federation and so on, they're all sort of clamped down on. Instead, we get imported the monastic orders we're much more familiar with today. So maybe worldly is the wrong word, but it certainly gets Europeanized. I think the temptation when we think about the introduction of kind of worldliness is to imagine there was once a golden age that everything else can be contrasted with. In some ways, I'm writing the book to say that that's a kind of fallacy, that there never was a golden age. I mean, I think if you read even the New Testament itself, you can see the struggle in the New Testament to defend the gospel. Peter and Paul fall out in Galatians. There's a really big issue there. Are Christians saved by faith, or do they need to do something with respect to the law? And you get a sense of that. Or if you read John's epistles, 2nd, 3rd John, you're finding there examples of Christians who are actually being pushed out of churches. So there wasn't even a golden age in the New Testament. There's never been a golden age for Christianity. A quote at the end, Vincent Toomey from Maynooth, who argues that the history of the church is a history of struggle and a history of moving from one crisis to another. I think that's a really good way of understanding the history of the church. It's not a movement from kind of a golden age to something worse. It's all the struggle is perennial. It never stops, and in a way, that's why Christians have to keep coming back to Scripture to know where they need to be anchored and to listen to the apostles as they work. But by the time you come to the Reformation, obviously there's a big push there to identify error. And Catholics are good at spotting error among Protestants and vice versa. And, and that goes on. And that obviously it goes on to the present day. People peer curiously and anxiously over the denominational fence towards each other. What's it really like on the other side? But the messiness continues, and the challenge for Christians is now and always has been to try to figure out what is it that Christ calls us to, and, how can we live to please him?
Excellent. Thank you, Crawford, and amen to that. So I want to ask you next, if I may, again, something, I'm taking you all over the map here, but so Loch Derg, even for a modern secularist kind of cultural Christianity, still seems to hold a certain mystique and power for people, and Patrick similarly. I want to ask you a little bit about that, and can you tell us a bit about the history and importance of places like Loch Derg and what role they took on in Irish life and imagination then?
Sure. Well, I mean, I've never been to Loch Derg, I've got to confess, but I have friends who have been and taken part in it. Loch Derg, the sort of centre of pilgrimage and sort of pious practices, is obviously a really important part of the lives, the spiritual lives of many Irish Catholics, and has been for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, I often sort of think it's kind of funny that if purgatory has an entrance, it's got to be in Donegal. I mean, that just sort of makes sense to me at a kind of fundamental level. But I don't mean to make light of it. I mean, really from, I'm not sure when, 8th, 9th century, Loch Derg becomes a focus of real spiritual activity, partly because of this exhibition of an entrance to purgatory. Now, it becomes very successful. It becomes one of the most successful pilgrimage sites in Europe, from what we can tell. And there's examples of people coming from as far away as Hungary, making pilgrimages that sometimes last years to get to Loch Derg, to get to see the entrance to purgatory, to pray, to fast, to engage in penitential acts of various kinds. But I think the really interesting thing about Loch Derg for me is that various popes were so concerned by it that they actually tried to shut it down. And there's various attempts in the later medieval period to do just that, but still the practice continues. Why does the practice continue? Well, I suppose it's a little bit like the Holy Well tradition, which continues to the present day as well. Irish Christianity is a kind of a formal core, and it's got lots of kind of spontaneous, improvised, traditional, informal contexts around that, doesn't it? And, with whether it's Holy Wells or whether it's Loch Derg, for a lot, not all, but a lot of its history, I think you see the kind of contest there between conventional, official religion and unofficial devotional practice. The book that we're talking about today, The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland, it's not a theological book, Mark. It's not really about big theological ideas. It's much more about practice. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because for most Irish Christians, what they do is often much more significant to them than what they believe. In some ways, there might be a sort of different category for what you believe, what you've been catechized into, but what you do might have a different kind of resonance, and you might have a much more, a very interesting, unofficial, informal explanation for what you do in terms of devotional practice or piety. So Holy Well continues to the present day, don't they? And Loch Derg does as well, but in a much more formal capacity now than ever before.
Thank you for that, Crawford. And then another, again, fascinating point of history for me was the impact of someone like Henry II. I want to ask you a little bit about that and some of the seismic changes that he brought about, from things like counties as we know them now to the English common law, and some of the contrasts between the common law, English common law, and the Brehon law that was popular in Ireland then.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I mentioned before the curious habit of having married priests in the Irish Church. And that's something that Henry II and the Norman invasion and the Gregorian Reformation, that comes as one big package, tries to sort out. But why does clerical marriage continue in Ireland? In many ways, I think that's a really good example of the way in which the norms of Brehon law continue, even though officially it doesn't exist, even though officially it's kind of pushed ever further westwards until it hits the Atlantic and sinks. It's still there, and it still shapes the way that a lot of people think about some of the most important relationships in their life, including including marriage. There's a great quote, and I can't remember who it refers to. I talk about it in the book, but some Irish cleric on the eve of the Protestant Reformation is described as a kind of a great saint. What is he called? The white dove of virtue. And it turns out he's got like 14 children. But that's not in any way frowned upon, because that's kind of normal. And that, I think, actually, the prevalence of clerical marriage in the Irish Church is one of the reasons why the Protestant Reformation fails. Because elsewhere in Europe, one of the great vehicles of Protestant criticism of the Catholic Church is, look at all of these hypocritical priests. You know, they're meant to be celibate, but look, that one's got a concubine, that one's got 3 children, you know, etc., etc., etc. And that becomes a vehicle for satire and Chaucer, but also a vehicle for theological opposition, Martin Luther, and so on. In Ireland, because the church, even though it's Catholic, because it had never really forbidden or really tried to control clerical marriage, it meant that there was no scandal attached to a Catholic priest having a wife and a family. So there was nothing for people to criticize. They were basically happy with it. Obviously, bishops, especially higher up the hierarchy went, became increasingly unhappy with it. But at a parish level, the people who were sort of paying to make all of this happen were basically happy, which meant that when Protestant ideas came, which had really depended upon exposing the hypocrisy of priests in so many other parts of Europe, the same arguments just didn't make sense here. Because yes, the same activity was happening, but it was legitimate, not through the canon law, not perhaps even through common law, but it was legitimized through Brehon law. It was a normal part of the Irish Christian experience. And ironically, I think one of the reasons why Ireland stays Catholic is because its priests are in recognized marriage type relationships and people are happy.
Thank you, Crawford. And you see these different troughs and waves of resurgence and fall and say different denominations and the Gaelic culture. I want to ask you about one. You mentioned this Gaelic resurgence. How did that come about? What were some of its effects then? And how did the colonists who came to Ireland then respond to such developments?
So this is in the sort of 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, Mark. Yeah. So the Normans turn up. They are agents or emissaries of Henry II. Henry II makes it eventually as well, and they try to do in Ireland what they have done in France, what they've done in Wales, which is basically to control the margins of this empire that Henry II controls. We often think of Henry II as the King of England, but he owned vast tracts of land in France as well. It's a kind of an empire he represents. So the Normans come. They really try to centralize control. They want to figure out how land should be controlled. They want to drive forward Pope Gregory's reformation of the church. They want to Catholicize the church in Ireland. But in large parts of the West and the North, especially in Ulster, that power never really gets successfully projected. We get evidence that the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller are heading out beyond the pale, beyond the sphere of Norman influence into the Gaelic parts of Ireland. We get the sense from some historical records that Knights Templar are involved in some quite unpleasant activities among Gaels, but the Gaels are there, and they continue to be organised in traditional ways. They continue to speak Irish. They are Catholic. They are Christian, but they have a very distinct way, I think, of expressing that, and they're much more, in a way, traditional compared to the very modern, brassy, kind of technologically driven, militarized state that comes with the Norman invasion. But the Normans, they're busy elsewhere. This is a big territory. They haven't really come to claim Ireland. They just don't want Ireland to be a problem. And so gradually their power recedes. Gradually, Gaelic Ireland begins to push back towards that. And if you look at a map of the medieval period, you can see the Pale shrink and shrink and shrink until really it just becomes a part of Leinster and maybe an area around Carrickfergus. But that's kind of it, and it's a real pale shadow of what it once had been. Now, we don't know very much about the Gaelic resurgence, I think. I'm not an expert, but what I read about it suggested that it's a part of the history of the island that has not been explored as thoroughly as many other parts of it have been. It's much easier for historians who tend to be not an especially linguistically able bunch a lot of the time. It's much easier for them to tell the kind of Norman side of the story, but it's much harder for them, I think, to get to grips with the Irish language as it's spoken in the later medieval period, where there may not be a lot of records, or to seriously engage with the Latin record keeping of the church. That's often the challenge as well. So I think, we just don't know. There was a great book published by Four Courts in Dublin, maybe about 10 years ago, called Gaelic Ireland, and it's looking at that late medieval period. But there's not a lot really beyond that. But one of the big complaints of that book is, no one's really spent enough time looking at this.
So hopefully that hole will be filled then, in part due to the influence of your work, Crawford, and thank you for that.
Project for you, maybe.
So, of particular interest to Benburb Priory, then I want to ask you about the 9 Years' War and things like the Flight of the Earls, because we have such an intimate connection with the O'Neills and Shane O'Neill's castle and the whole history, One Rose Battle of Benburb. And why were those events so significant in our society in that short and the long term, of course?
Yeah. Well, the conflict that you mentioned comes really as a consequence of a much later phase of English influence in Ireland, and I suppose a very militarized response on the part of some leaders of Gaelic society to push back against an Anglo and English Protestant attempt to impose religious change in the country. You get a sense really from the 1530s that the Protestant Reformation is probably not going to make it. And that's really early. The Protestant Reformation begins in Germany in 1517, but by the 1530s in Ireland, you get a real sense it's probably not going to make it. And one of the reasons why is because major landowners, people who've got real positions of power and influence, are organizing militarily to resist it. And there's various rebellions, various kind of risings through the 16th century that make that case. Then towards the end of that century, the 9 Years' War really kind of solidifies that, when you've got this kind of last hurrah of Gaelic military culture pushing against English military adventurism on the island. And of course, there's an attempt to coordinate with various European powers, an invasion attempt at Kinsale in 1601, which fails. And the Gaelic rebels, for all that they are Catholic, for all that they are depending upon military aid from the continent, they find themselves isolated and alone. Now, they find themselves isolated and alone while facing the biggest army that had ever left England. And the Earl of Essex leads this massive expeditionary force, but he can't beat them. So, they're able to, the Gaelic rebels, if you like, are able to use their knowledge of the land very much to their advantage. They're light on foot, their weaponry, they understand the boggy parts of the island and how to use that strategically and tactically. The English are basically coming with their tried and tested methods of continental warfare, big, heavy military technology, and it just doesn't work. So Essex is coming, he's trying to defeat the Gaelic Earls. They can't beat him, but he can't beat them. But the point is, he can't beat them with the biggest army that's ever left England. And so it's a kind of a stalemate. And the stalemate, I suppose, indicates, first of all, that people will die rather than give up their Catholicism and the kind of Gaelic culture that supports it. But secondly, that English might is never really going to shift that population to change. Now, it's at least arguable that encouraging people towards religious change is not made most likely by threatening them with death. I think there's probably something people can think about in relation to that. But that's basically what happens, and that continues to happen really until the 1650s, when the much more controversial invasion of Oliver Cromwell might actually be the first English administration on the island that doesn't threaten everyday Catholics with death for the practice of their religion. And again, that's not how we think of Oliver Cromwell, but that might be something that is true of his 11 years or so on the island.
Excellent, thank you, Crawford. And I think alongside certain nuances like that, your book offers us the actual distinct identities between some of the different denominations. You mentioned Presbyterians, how they differ from Anglicans, Church of Ireland, and things like that. So I just want to ask you a little bit about that now, because we have this conception of Protestant now as one catch-all, especially in that political binary. And what then lent itself to Presbyterians becoming more culturally powerful in the north in, say, the 17th century and afterwards? And how did that manifest itself then?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so the origins of Protestant denominational communities, different denominations, I think really begins in the 1650s with the invasion of Oliver Cromwell. Well, actually, I tell a lie. Back in 1642, you've got the formation of the first Presbyterian community when Scottish troops land in Carrickfergus and set up a presbytery. So that's the beginning of Presbyterianism, but that's 110 years after the Protestant Reformation begins. So from the 1530s through to the 1640s, there's one Protestant church which is supported mainly by people, almost exclusively by people who are immigrants into the country, planters, merchants, whatever they may be, soldiers, whatever they may be. There's a census taken in maybe about 1603 or something, 1604, that tries to work out how many Irish-born Catholics have converted to the Reformed Church. And they reckon that over the previous couple of generations, around about 120 Irish Catholics have converted to Protestantism. And that's in the first 70 or so years of Protestant Reformation. It's not a great success. But there's obviously a much bigger Protestant community. So where does that come from? That's mainly come as a consequence of immigration. But it's basically cohesive. It's under the oversight of the Church of Ireland. By the 1640s, with the arrival of Scottish soldiers in the immediate aftermath of the 1641 rebellion, rising, revolution, you've got the beginning of Presbyterianism. So now you've got two religious groups, both claiming to be Protestant. By 1650, with the arrival of all the Cromwellian troops, you've got the introduction of Baptists, Congregationalists, Quakers, and a host of other much smaller religious movements that didn't survive into the present day. So Presbyterians obviously became very powerful, very influential in the north, especially in Antrim and Down. They were also in places like Donegal. The Church of Ireland was mostly influential in places like Derry, Armagh, and places like that. So there's a kind of a geographical division of influence within these different Protestant denominations in that period. They have a very uneasy relationship through the 17th century. They are competing with one another. By the end of the 17th century, after the Glorious Revolution, so-called, the adherents of the Church of Ireland set up the institutions of the state, and the state becomes an Anglican state. They represent about 10% of the population. Presbyterians represent about 10% of the population. Catholics represent about 80% of the population. But it's an Anglican state. It's not a Protestant state, it's an Anglican state. And what that means is that Presbyterians and Catholics are both subject to penal laws of various kinds, not in the same way, but with the same purpose, which is to ensure that neither Presbyterians nor Catholics will represent a credible military threat to the Anglican state. So the Anglican state attacks Presbyterians and other Protestant dissenters, Baptists, Quakers, and so on, in different ways from Catholics, but with the same purpose, which is to ensure that they remain in control of the state and in control of the massive amount of land that's been transferred from Catholic into Anglican hands. So the land transfers to the 17th century are really the big story of the 17th century. In the early 1600s, you get the beginnings of plantations in the north. There'd already been a plantation project in Munster in the 1580s that had pretty much failed. The plantation in the north is much, much more successful, and it remains very credible. And that begins the successful transfer of land ownership. The Cromwellian period really accelerates that. By the time you come to the end of the 18th century, the end of the 17th, early 18th century, Irish Catholics are reduced to owning around 5% of the land mass of the island as a whole. So, there's lots of myths about the whole Teheller Connacht kind of thing. So we don't need to exaggerate what's going on, but we do need to realize that there's a determined effort to impoverish and to control. And it's done in the name of the established Church of Ireland with the intention of preserving its security almost at any cost.
Excellent. That's most clarifying. Thank you, Crawford. And another element which I think is really important in deconstructing our crude conceptions of religion and how we understand our society is the influence that you point to of the French and the American revolutions and how that manifests itself within different communities in different ways. And I find that interesting in a sense because that maybe almost replaces theology with ideology, and history is read in a different way. And would you like to speak to that and some of the influences from that end?
Yeah, sure. So we're moving into the sort of later part of the 18th century. But by the later part, by the 1750s, 1760s, Catholics and Presbyterians feel the full weight of the penal laws. So we're much more familiar with the Catholic experience. No one's allowed to own more than 30 acres. Fathers are not allowed to, fathers can't give that 30 acres to a single son. It's got to be split up between them, which is why, of course, we've got so many small farms, even to the present day. Catholics have to sell any horse, no matter how good it is, for £5. All of that really to impoverish, to reduce, and to take away the kind of military potential of the 80% Catholic population. But Presbyterians feel the penal laws too. The state does not recognise Presbyterian marriages. It always recognises Catholic marriages, but it doesn't recognise Presbyterian marriages. And in fact, it won't fully recognise Presbyterian marriages until the 1840s. So what that means is really from the 1690 type period until about 1844, the Anglican state says to Presbyterians who are married by a Presbyterian minister, you are living in sin. Your children are illegitimate. You're not able to pass any property to them because your children have no status within the law. They're illegitimate children. And that's just one of several ways in which Presbyterians feel the brunt of the penal laws. So by the 1760s, 1770s, it's fair to say that Irish Catholics and Presbyterians are pretty cheesed off with the way that the state is working. And Presbyterians in particular have got very strong links with North America because lots of them have gone there. The family connections in North America are very strong. That first wave of Irish emigration to America is strongly Presbyterian. And they watch with joy as their relatives take on the British military, and the 13 colonies begin to rebel. And, Bunker Hill, when they get news of the success of Bunker Hill, they light bonfires and they begin to celebrate because as far as they can see, this is a crowd of dissenters just like themselves, throwing off the kind of imperial power of an Anglican state. At the same time, the Catholic hierarchy is appalled by revolution. And the Catholic hierarchy remains very conservative through this whole period. And at the same time as the Presbyterians are rejoicing at the American Revolution, Catholic bishops in Ireland are writing to the government saying, we deplore this, we're absolutely on your side. Both of those strategies, celebrating the revolution or disclaiming the revolution, were both aiming to achieve the same thing, which was a recalibration of these religious groups' rights within the state. The Catholic bishops thought they could reclaim their rights by being nice to the state. The Presbyterians thought they could reclaim their rights by trying to overturn it. So all of that goes on. 1798, the French Revolution. Well, Irish Catholics by this stage have begun to realise that their political fortunes are going to have to be in terms of Republican ideology. And the reason for that was that after 1690, when James II flees to France, Irish Catholics typically remain supporters of the Stuarts. So, the Vatican recognises James II's son, and so on. And if you go to Rome, you'll find in Rome memorials to James III and other monarchs that these islands have never had. But so until the 1760s, Irish Catholics still have this kind of sentimental attachment to the Stuart family, then in exile with decreasing fortunes. But I think it's around 1766, the Vatican says it's no longer going to recognise the claims of the Stuarts to the throne. And when that happens, as that news of that comes back to Ireland, Irish Catholics begin to realise that their political fortunes are not going to come, they're not going to be delivered through the Stuarts. The Stuarts are not going to come and rescue them. The Hanoverians are certainly not going to rescue them. So they have to think about government in a fundamentally new way. So they become Republicans. Gradually, over time, they become Republicans. That becomes really accentuated when the French Revolution happens in 1789. And, you have got a Republican revolution against monarchy, the execution of the the King and Queen in 1792 kind of puts a full stop to that. But around the same period, a bunch of middle-class Presbyterians in Belfast begin to form a pressure group called the Society of United Irishmen. And it's a trans-denominational society that welcomes anyone who wants to see a constitutional recalibration. And these middle-class intellectuals form a pressure group that within about 5 years becomes basically a militia that has over 100,000 men in arms. It begins to attract a lot of Catholic support, obviously. It sends Wolfe Tone to Paris to negotiate on their behalf with the French. It's coordinating a foreign policy. It's coordinating an armed military rising with a major European power. And it really threatens the state in a way that no other activity in the 18th century had been able to do. So if Irish Presbyterians had been radicalized by the events in America in the 1770s, Irish Catholics get radicalized by the events in France 12, 15 years later. But the combination, the radicalizing of both of those groups against the 10% Anglican state really begins to set in motion both what turns out to be the bloodbath of 1798, when all of these Enlightenment goals just end up in tatters. The Battle of Aughrim has the highest number of deaths of any day in Irish history. I mean, it's an absolute bloodbath. But yet, it also sets in motion the drive towards the Act of Union, as Westminster realises that Dublin MPs cannot be trusted with the security of Ireland. And if they can't be trusted with the security of Ireland, they can't be trusted with the security of England, because Ireland was going to be the back door for a French invasion. And, what was going to be the consequence of that? And so, we find then after 1800 that Presbyterians move from being this really radical Republican group, the originators of Republican ideology in the United Irishmen, to move increasingly to identify with the state, so that we move from that very complex, religiously diverse set of communities at the end of the 18th century to the kind of binary between Catholic and Protestant that we're much more familiar with today. But that happens over the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. Right. So my apologies that we're taking such a whistle-stop tour, because the book's very rich and there's so much in there. I've skipped out so much in my questions, but I want to try and at least cover some of the main points as we go through chronologically through the ages. So another element then, building upon what you're speaking about, the influence of those revolutions and the desire for a republic, and what then were some of the main undercurrents that led to the desire for home rule, and then what were some of the fissures that caused in our society amongst Catholics and Protestants and different guys?
Well, the desire for home rule at the end of the 18th century would have been mainly advanced by those who would benefit most from home rule, i.e. the Anglican elite that controlled the Dublin Parliament. 100 years later, home rule means something completely different. It means rule by the majority population. And the reason why the meaning of home rule changes is because the number of those who are able to get involved in voting changes over the course of that period as well. So you've got the movement of Catholic emancipation that begins, I suppose, in the 1780s, as more rights are given back to Catholics at the end of the penal laws, more rights are returned to them. Full Catholic emancipation in 1829, when of course Daniel O'Connell gets elected as MP, but he's not allowed to sit in Westminster because there's a ban on Catholic members of Parliament. And that's really in response to that ban goes. Catholics can enter Parliament, but the political nation is now vast and overwhelmingly Catholic in Ireland, in a way that it wasn't previously, because so many people now are able to vote. So by the time you come to the 1880s, there's massive pressure now for breaking that link with Westminster and returning a parliament to Dublin, but a parliament that would be dominated by the choices of the majority population, which is obviously Catholic. There's various kinds of economic reasons for that, but I think fundamentally there's an issue there of identity and of national aspiration, that the rise of nationalism is really feeding and supporting through much of this period. I mean, I think it's really curious that the Presbyterians who were so against the British state in the 1790s, by the 1880s, have come really to identify with it and to see it as in a way, their saviour. And by the end of the 19th century, we find that, and I think this is probably one of the kind of consequences of a big kind of evangelical revival that takes place in 1859, which really breaks down denominational barriers in a very interesting way. But one of the political consequences of that evangelical revival is to persuade Presbyterians, Baptists, Congregationalists, and Church of Ireland people that they're basically all the same. And that no matter what their political or economic relationship used to be, they have much more in common with each other than any one group of them has with the majority population. So by the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, the rich and complex set of communities that used to exist in this island basically boils down to which is Protestants versus Catholics. Protestants who identify with the state and want to see Westminster rule continue. Catholics who identify with the nation and want to see parliamentary rule re-established in Dublin, which of course is eventually what happens. Well, the pressure towards home rule, I suppose, breaks down with the announcement of the First World War, and that in a way takes a lot of the steam out of the issue. Legislation had been passed for home rule, but it was on the statute books. It wasn't going to be implemented until the war was over. But a small, but I think increasingly influential group of Republicans based in Dublin decided that they wouldn't want to wait for the end of the war for home rule to be renewed. And so in 1916, on hugely symbolically around Easter weekend, they begin to put in practice the whole mythology of blood sacrifice that Patrick Pearse had written about so eloquently and movingly, and try to have this kind of insurrection in the name of the Irish state, actually in the name of Irish men of all religious backgrounds, Irish men and women of all religious backgrounds, if you read the proclamation of the Republic that gets issued at that time. And they set out to achieve this. Well, the Catholic hierarchy did not support it. The Catholic hierarchy have a kind of a habit of standing at arm's length from revolutionary movements or Republican movements, partly I think because they see how revolution leads eventually to attacks on the church in most places where revolution happens. And the same thing happens in Ireland as well. The Catholic hierarchy are very critical of the attempted revolution in 1916, but eventually public opinion swings behind the rebels. They become identified as heroes very, very quickly, especially after the executions begin. And obviously some of the men and women involved in that were people of enormous personal piety, whose writings, whose letters, even whose last-minute conversions speak some kind of religious sincerity, that for them this was an almost religious calling. It was a kind of vocation to redemptive self-sacrifice on behalf of the nation that they had really come to identify with and wanted to serve in this way. So, neither of the two sides, I think, in the Home Rule dispute had wanted to see partition. It's the solution that nobody wanted, but it's the solution that's proposed. Obviously, it leads to massive debate and renewed civil war in the pro and anti-treaty forces in the south, principally. Though there was some action, I think, up here as well. And that leads us to the two jurisdictions that we're much more familiar with post-1922, what becomes a republic and what becomes Northern Ireland. A republic, the constitution that recognises the special status of the Catholic Church and gives a huge amount of power and influence to Catholic institutions because it needs them. The Catholic Church is the only body, really, apart from the GAA, that can unite people from the pro and anti-treaty factions after the war. You've got that in the south. In the north, you've got a much less stable, much more religiously diverse political community that nevertheless is styled as having a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people.
Thank you, Crawford. And then after the split of Ireland into the two states, then there has been in both parts now a kind of increasing secularization, which maybe in some ways lends itself to a common Christian identity standing against the, at times, aggressive secular society, perhaps. And I want to ask you about how that has played out then, starting, as you describe in the book, with the media, say, in the South, and how it both reflected and created different social realities, often increasingly at odds with the Catholic Church, and especially through the 60s and that revolution that happened around the world. But would you like to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, Ireland seems to be a bit of a latecomer to the kind of secularization of Western societies. So as you say, in the 1960s, the sexual revolution makes a huge impact, certainly in Europe, certainly in North America. Doesn't seem to make a massive impact on this island, north or south. Still quite deeply conservative. And it's conservative because the media is really quite tightly controlled through much of this period. The Irish Times through this period would still have been a Protestant-owned, Protestant-controlled West Britain type of media outlet, but it would never have attempted to do the kind of exposés that the Irish media certainly was willing to do 30 years after that. So by the time you come to the 1990s, I think you see a kind of a tipping point. John Paul II comes in 1979. He's met by 2.5 million citizens of the island. Does his open air mass in Phoenix Park, attended by, I think, 1.25 million people. A vast number of people willing to turn out and see him. And that seems to lead almost immediately to attempts by some Catholics in the Republic to copper-fasten the Catholic ethos of the state. So you've got that referendum on the equal right of mother and child, kind of an anti-abortion referendum, I think in 1983 offhand. There's very quickly then a response to that, which is an attempt to legalize divorce, which fails. But Catholic teaching in each of those referenda is being supported by a slightly declining number of people. And you can kind of plot the number of votes that are coming in defense of Catholic social teaching over the course of the next couple of decades, as various referenda allow that to happen. And so, by the time we come to the 1990s, legalization of same-sex sexual activity, 1993, that obviously is a major sea change in the way that the state thinks about itself and its relation to smaller communities within it. As the 1990s give way to the 21st century, the pace of change really accelerates, and you can look at the last couple of referenda there over the last 5 years to get a sense of how weak now, how small now is the number of voters who are willing to turn out in defence of Catholic social teaching on those issues. I don't think we've quite got hold of what has been going on there, because if I'm correct, it was in the last of those referendums that the blasphemy law was also being voted on, and no church, not a single denomination, was campaigning for the retention of the blasphemy law. But nevertheless, 1/3 of voters who voted in that referendum, which is over 500,000 people, voted to say that they wanted the blasphemy law to be retained, including 48% of voters in Donegal. So, I think it's very easy to think that the kind of tide of secularization is kind of irresistible. But there is this hidden island that hasn't got a name, hasn't got a spokesperson, isn't organized politically, but can still pull out over 500,000 people to vote in defense of a law that not one of the Christian denominations is trying to preserve. So who is organizing that? Who are these people? Where are they? Well, a load of them are in Donegal, of course. But what does that mean? And I kind of think we haven't really got to grips with what that might represent.
Excellent. Thank you, Crawford. And from then that Christian perspective for Catholics and different Reformed folks and Anglicans and so on, then as we're describing as an historical phenomena, even the book's title, The Rise and Fall of Christy in Ireland, then if you want to put on your prophetic hat, then do you foresee is there the possibility of a rise again in line with what you're speaking about there? And what might that look like? And what are some of the new alignments that we are seeing or could see?
A fascinating question, Mark. Obviously, it's impossible to see the future. The book is called The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland, but the conclusion ends with the possibility of resurrection. Now, the point about resurrection, as any Christian will say, is that it's always unexpected. And we just don't know how this is going to pan out. If there is no dramatic change, I think we can see Christians being marginalized. I think that's obviously already happening. I think that it's obviously very difficult for Christians to speak about certain things in public. I'm not just speaking about social media, I just mean generally. Social media is a kind of a problem in itself. So, I think that humanly speaking, a lot of people who attend Christian denominations will probably find themselves going with the cultural flow, so that there are certain Protestant denominations who shall remain nameless, who generally track social change about 10, 15 years behind it happening. Mm-hmm. So they're not up with the youth, but we kind of follow the youth as that works through. But then there's other Christian churches, Christian denominations that have, I think, quite successfully resisted some of those social changes. Now, there is going to be, I think, a dissociation between the clergy, who are going to have to ask quite searching questions to themselves about how far they're willing to resist social change. And not all will. And I think also in the part of lay people, if you want to use that language, I think it's likely that the number of people who remain committed to anything that we recognize as an historic expression of Christianity is going to decrease quite quickly until it hits kind of rock bottom. But once it hits that rock bottom, it's a bit like, in a way, it's a bit like vaccination for COVID. You can get a certain percentage of a given population vaccinated, but there's always a kind of a stubborn minority who won't do it. And I think it'll be a bit similar in terms of how Christians respond to changes in society. I think what it's going to reveal is what Jesus told us the church is like. It's wheat and tares growing together until the time of harvest. And I think there's going to be a much more obvious division between wheat and tares. But I think it's an opportunity. I'm not gloomy about it. I'm pessimistic about some things, but I'm not fundamentally gloomy about it, because in a way, anything that clarifies what Christianity is a good thing. Anything that dissociates the message of the Bible from the message even of religious denominations where necessary is a good thing. And anything that allows the Bible to set the agenda for what Christians do and what Christians should believe is a good thing. And anything that makes Christian people from whatever background sit up and think, wait a minute, I don't belong here. Out the way I thought it was going to, what's happening? Anything that makes them have that experience and then say, well, I can find the answers to all of this in Scripture. That's a good thing. Because the Holy Spirit, we know, works through Scripture. He inspires the church. He gathers the church together for worship. And, I mentioned earlier Vincent Toomey Maynooth. The history of the church is a history of crisis. That's going to continue to be the case. Sometimes the crises are easier to deal with, sometimes much harder. But that's just the history of the church. It is a history of crisis. And the comfort, the encouragement that Christians have is that, even though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we're only walking through it. The good shepherd is leading us. And if we remain attentive to the shepherd, we'll be fine.
Amen. Thank you so much for your time today, Crawford, and for writing this wonderful book, which I would encourage people to read. And I should say that Crawford is due to speak at Benbow Priory in 2022. So you'll be able to see that on our new website, and you're most welcome to come and join in this great conversation and what the future holds. So I appreciate, again, your time. And I just want to close by asking you, is there anything else that you're working on now, Crawford, that you'd like to tell us about?
Can I plug something, Mark? Can I plug something? So a few friends and I have, I suppose, been thinking a little bit about the way in which we haven't really celebrated what Christianity has achieved in Ireland. In other words, we haven't really celebrated Christian culture. And so we've started a little project to try and do that. So this is it's a journal, it's a nice hardback journal. It's called The Round Tower Review. And you can read more about it online at a website called theroundtowerreview.com. And it's maybe 120 pages, various essays about Christian tradition, about thinking about speech, some creative writing, and poetry, short stories, and people might be interested in that. The second thing I would say is, obviously, 7th December is the 1,500th anniversary of the birth of St. Columba. And if any of your listeners follow the Tablet magazine, I've got an article coming out on St. Columba in that they might be interested in reading.
Wonderful. Thank you, Crawford. And then where can viewers or listeners find out more about you and your work personally?
Well, I'm on Twitter every now and again. The name there is at Gribben C, at GRIBBENC. So that's probably as good a place as any. I'm really happy to hear from people. They can get my email on the Queen's website, and always a delight to hear from people.
Thank you so much, and God bless you, Crawford.
Thank you, Mark.